I look at Israel and think, well, that wouldn't be very safe for me or for my family, so I better, I do feel safer here. But now I don't feel completely safe here, if I'm honest, and I never thought I'd ever say that.
Columnist Danny Finkelstein was posting on Twitter about the awful anti-Semitic abuse he'd received over the previous week, and it made us think about, is it fair to say when anti-Semitism has been with us for millennia, is there a sort of new anti-Semitism? Is that what we're seeing on Bondi Beach? Is there further cause for what is already dreadful concern? Well, Danny Finkelstein is in the studio with us now. Danny, morning to you.
Good morning, good morning.
Is it right to talk about a new anti-Semitism of sorts?
Well, I think it is, because before about 2000, 2001, I really never thought about it a lot. I mean, it was obviously something we talked about a bit in the Jewish community, and there was the history of my family and other people in the community which was always present. But it certainly wasn't something that I imagined when I joined the Times, which was in 2001, I'd end up writing much about or talking much about. I'm really quite astonished and, to be quite honest, a bit depressed by how much that's been necessary. I've always regarded it as a sort of private or community thing. And now it's become political, because I do think it's connected, not just, what looks like it's an attack just on the Jewish community in Australia is really an attack on the whole structure of liberal democracy. It's an attack on tolerance. It's an attack on people agreeing to disagree and settling their differences in the political arena. It's an attack on all of those things.
So is 9/11 a sort of a meeting point in this journey? 2001. This is did that change everything?
No, I think insofar as Osama bin Laden wanted to change the discourse, and I'm not sure that something quite like that occurred to him, that it was successful, because it did. And I remember watching a BBC, or to be fair, it may have possibly at that point been Channel 4, so I don't want to blame the BBC for it, a BBC reporter or a television reporter walking down the street in Jerusalem saying, I'm here in Jerusalem where 9/11 started. And I thought, well, it didn't start there. I don't know what you're talking about. And that's when I first realised it was going to come back to, Israel, and Israel then knocks onto Jews, because Israel is partly the creation of the disaster of Jews in Europe. So it was people having an argument there about how best to make Jews safe. And now some Jews are saying, we should go and live in Israel. I look at Israel and think, well, that wouldn't be very safe for me or for my family, so I better, I do feel safer here. But now I don't feel completely safe here, if I'm honest, and I never thought I'd ever say that.
Well, you still don't feel safe here?
No, I never thought I'd ever say that. We're doing the very best that we can as a community to stay safe. I actually, when people sort of turn to Keir Starmer or blame Rishi Sunak, the mainstream of British politics, they are trying hard. I do think we probably haven't taken I definitely think we haven't taken seriously people saying things like globalise the Intifada. This is what these people were doing, right? They were globalising the Intifada. That's precisely it. So anybody who put up a banner...
that's a fair criticism, you think?
Well, it's true. I mean, that is just, just in very simple terms, the Intifada was a violent resistance and they want to globalise it. So that's what these people were doing. And if someone put up a big poster and said, in Manchester or in Birmingham, we want to globalise the Intifada, well, that is the consequence of that. So we shouldn't tolerate that, in my view, and I'm very much a pro-free speech person. That is not, I think, a respectable thing to be allowed to say, because it's encouraging people to go and commit violent acts.
I don't agree with this, but some of our listeners have raised it. I thought I'd put it to you. It's a bit victim blamey, this, to me, and it's a bit like 9/11 was caused by America's decisions to be in the Middle East. I mean, everything comes back to a sort of decision made by a country, therefore terrorism is somehow justified. Some people have said this morning that Israel's behaviour has created an environment in which people are legitimately angry with Israel, and therefore Netanyahu is slightly responsible for creating this situation.
No, it's a perfectly legit people, and as I just said, people can have free speech. I'm not offended by people making that argument. Let's have a discussion about it. Is that when it started? Right? When my grandfather was having an argument with the Zionists in the 1930s, Israel hadn't even been created yet. So there still managed to be a Holocaust at that point. And if you read, a friend of mine was reading Simon Sharma's History of the Jews, and he pointed out to me that every 200 pages somebody tried to eradicate the whole of Judaism and the whole of Jewry, and he said, how likely do we think that stopped? So sure, if you see this as something that's only happened just since 1948, then you can make a legitimate case for that. But you could look at it the other way. You could look at what's happened in Israel to Israel as being an example of people not wishing to tolerate a load of Jews living there, which is really what I think a lot of anti-Israel resistance is. So you could flip it on its head. Sure, people do things that other people object to, and they use that as an excuse for violence, but there's no excuse for doing that in Australia when you can have a legitimate debate about it. Here, you can make that point, I'm not offended and we will engage in it, and we don't need to shoot each other. So it doesn't justify that kind of violent behaviour or calling for others to engage in violent behaviour in Israel or anywhere else, because the Jews who live in Israel, they're not different in nature, that they're often related to or coming from the people who live in Stanmore.
Are there useful idiots in all of this, where people who legitimately want to criticise Israel know that they're going along with other people who say globalise the intifada, who don't just want to criticise the political behaviour of Israel or the war behaviour of Israel? Is there a sort of useful idiot problem?
Well, we all wade into debates which we don't understand very well, and what I would urge people to do is to think about the issue of the safety of Jews worldwide and to understand why somebody's reaction might be, this is all because Israel's being bad. Other people's reaction, and certainly in the Jewish community, is, well, we do at least need one place where we can defend ourselves if other people aren't going to. So I suppose it's like a call to understanding, and that doesn't mean, because people will have a legitimate objection. People in Israel do it, and I do, to some of the actions of the Netanyahu government in resisting the questions over whether particular acts were necessary in order to suppress Hamas. For example, the restrictions of blockades of aid and medical supplies and other things. And you can object to that completely while still understanding that globalise the intifada, or even, let's drive Israel out altogether from the river to the sea, whether those things are legitimate things to say, and whether they don't encourage somebody, admittedly a small minority of those people, to go and take a gun and shoot innocent people.
You don't need very many of them to do it to make an absolutely horrendous situation.
Correct.
You need one or two, as in this case. Hugo Rifkin's joined us. Good morning. With us from 10 o'clock. We spoke to a friend of Rabbi Eli Schlanger, who'd written about this issue, what happens when these things happen, and he said, he's now dead very sadly because he was killed in this
yes, I know.
Massacre. He said, be more Jewish, act more Jewish, appear more Jewish. You can't back away from this. You've still got to light the candles together. But that's a big. I saw Jewish people in London gathered together, and I thought, you're a brave bunch of people, because you don't know who's out there.
In the 1930s, my grandfather, there were several different groups inside German Jewry. Some were saying, let's assimilate. In other words, just give up Judaism. It's more trouble than it's worth. And after the war, some people did that. That's why people occasionally find out their parents or grandparents were Jewish, because they didn't say. They thought it was more trouble than it's worth. There were people who thought communism was the solution, which my dad can attest, in his experience with Stalin, was not the solution. And there are some people who say the solution was to go and live in Israel, and you can see the problems with that. And some people who say the solution was with my grandfather trying to ride the tiger of the German community. The tragedy for Jews, none of those were a completely safe solution. But I'm sure that giving up your Judaism, is something that people do, and then they regret, decades later.
How do you feel about it all, Hugo? How's your last 24 hours been for you?
It's funny. We've been talking about this this morning with Jewish colleagues and Jewish friends. It's this sort of odd mix of, on one level, you're quite desensitized to it. You're like, oh, this again. On the other, you look at yourself in horror that you've become desensitized to it. Very bleak yesterday. Very bleak because of the sense that there is nowhere in the world that Jews can go. And don't get me wrong, I don't feel like I need to go anywhere. But just this sense of, is there a place? Is there a place that's safe? I'm not quite sure where it would be. Fascinating hearing Danny talking about the choices Jews made after the war. My own family, kind of my mother's family, almost did make the choice to sort of ignore their Judaism, live entirely secular lives. My father's family kind of made a different choice. And as Danny says, it all kind of ends up in the same place.
Well, that's the sort of historical inevitability, sadness, and all of this. That this just keeps. Yeah. It happened 800 years ago. It happened 600 years ago.
I think Hugo and I would agree. It's not just about us, right? So it's really, really important. We need to live in a stable, liberal, democratic society in which we tolerate each other, in which we understand each other's difference and recognise that we don't settle our differences this way.
I'm into that.